last lecture for the season just because of the way the every other work thing, the way the every other week works. The next week falls on Thanksgiving, and I figured we'd have lectures so we can hear this. So our lecture then for the 14th will be Neil Baer, who's a writer and producer of PR. And he's going to come and talk about designing complex systems. In this particular case, it happens to be the highest selling TV series of all time. So that ought to be interesting just from the point of view of what is it like to design something. He just finished the script, the last script that he wrote was shot live. And of course, shooting live television now originated the old Craftsman and all that sort of stuff, dramatic television, and now, of course, it's a big deal, and it's an incredible thing for so long. It's $1 million for just a big show. So that's the schedule, and then we'll begin again in the spring. As you know, I'm totally open to your suggestions, comments, feedback, all that sort of thing. This is really very serious. I mean, I kind of just pick what I think is interesting, and then keep telling me about what we can do. Today we have Bob Somol, and I just met Bob Somol about 15 seconds ago. And the reason is he's a very busy person. And I had asked some people the same thing I asked you at a party at Dan Berger's during the summer. And somebody said, oh, Bob Somol, got to get him up there. So it's been email and phone calls and all that kind of thing, and just materialized. So rather than pretend I know lots of things about him and that sort of thing, I told him I'll just let him situate himself. So he'll define who he is. He's a theoretician at Avant-Garde, he's a practicing architect, which is UCLA, and he has very interesting. Bob, thanks for coming.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, we had a meeting with a contractor this morning, so I sort of didn't really get all the slides together, so there'll be sort of gaps, and you may have to reconstruct the lecture with me when I sort of go back and forth, because they're not paired, which is a problem. So there may be a little back and forth. But actually I saw Ken Franklin recently, who sort of in Chicago, and he said, well, you know, I left this slide in New York, and it would really prove the case if I had it. So it's sort of like that. You have to sort of imagine that the slides that are missing are really the ones that would actually convince you of what I'm saying. When giving a talk, I guess I always have the possibility of either boring you with our own design work or boring you with somebody else's. So today it's going to be the latter. I'm going to bore you with other people's design. Although I think that ultimately this history that I'm going to show, which will be a kind of very condensed version of one aspect of the last 40 years, is in fact part of our design practice. And that partially, it's not a really, although you may have seen it all before, it's not a particularly true history. It just happens to be our version of a slice of history. And I think that's important in establishing a prescriptive project. In other words, I think that the way that we use history and theory and criticism in the office, because we write and do graphic design as well as architecture, as well as teach, is to establish a project, a contemporary project. So this is sort of toward that, basically recycling history for our own purposes. Because I think that looking at history needs to address certain contemporary concerns, the issues that I want to talk about today are the issue, I'm going to primarily talk about the issue of the diagram and our understanding of it. And I guess I want to do that in lieu of, or let's say against, certain models today. I think there's a kind of typical pendulum swing in architecture, and that whereas, you learn, for, say, the 40 years starting in the late 50s, or perhaps not that entire period of time, but for a lot of it, the interest seemed to be in issues of representation and design in terms of architecture. And recently, the pendulum swing has gone back to some notion of the real. And I guess it's against that model that I want to talk about the possibility of a diagram, that it escapes this opposition of this pendulum swing between a representational architecture or an architecture engaged with reality. So, in other words, in some sense, for me to be, I guess it's a science and technology lecture series, so it's a little bit perverse maybe that I'm presenting in this, because I'm a little bit skeptical of the ways in which science and technology have recently been incorporated into architecture, in particular as building technology or behavioral science. In other words, two trajectories that might point back to some real, whether that real is in the technology or ultimately kind of environmental technology and issues of a certain version of sustainability on the one hand, or a kind of vision, I would say a limited vision of the community that comes out of certain limited models of behavioral science on the other. So it's in a certain way against those models of, you know, back to the real, whether it's technology or and the environment or the community, a certain limited model of the community that I actually want the diagram to work toward understanding, and to promote alternative models of community and environment, or collectives and ecologies. So again, I think that this kind of reality check that's hit the popular press has also, you know, in the higher realms of theory, whether it is someone like Ken Frampton in his model of tectonics as against representation, or someone like Magali Sarfati Larson, a kind of sociologist who says architecture, you know, is not the discipline that represents or signifies, but that is, as a kind of essentialism. I want to sort of avoid those two pendulum swings back to that version of the real. And I think that ultimately the diagram uncovers an alternative reality, or maps what I'll call the virtual. So this is my sort of stand-in for the contemporary situation. I guess part of this interest in the diagram is, these are from Rosalind Krauss's book, The Optical Unconscious. And what Krauss says is that it dawned on her one day that it was easier or more useful, let's say, to understand the history of modernism as a diagram than it was as a narrative or a story, a kind of linear story. So her version of modernism, of high modernism, comes out of this diagram on the left. I'm not going to get into this argument, which revolves around issues of figure and ground. In other words, a very Gestalt-oriented model of opticality and modernism. And against that, she offers this thing on the bottom right, which is basically Lacan's diagram of the mirror stage, as an alternative understanding of what she calls the optical unconscious. So against her diagram of modernism's basis in opticality and Gestalt science, she wants to use the kind of psychoanalytic or Lacanian model of a repressed history of modernism. In any case, I think it's interesting that Krauss decides that it's the topological qualities of a diagram that can make sense of history, as opposed to the typical narrative of a beginning, middle, and end. And it's that kind of diagrammatic understanding that I want to, in a certain way, apply to architecture. And I think that Krauss herself is a kind of fellow traveler to the architects that I'm going to talk about. I mean, broadly, the architects that I've been working on have been sort of loosely defined as a Neo Avant-Garde. And I think that they are contemporaries of Krauss's, and that they also have the same kind of diagrammatic understanding. Again, to go back to sort of show maybe the basis of Krauss's optical model on the left, the Gestalt, the famous face vase opposition of Gestalt psychology, and which in fact, I guess the story that I want to tell begins in 1957 or so, or the field that I want to map out begins there. And with Colin Rowe and John Haydick and Robert Slutsky, et cetera, in Texas in the late 50s. And their development of a kind of American formalism in the post-war period. And they're informed by kind of Gestalt psychology, appropriation of that model of science, let's say, into architecture. And as well as a kind of aesthetic cubist model. I guess this is obviously Haydick's project in Berlin to suggest the kind of long half-life that these models have. In other words, diagrams or models taken from the science of the 30s finally makes it to architecture in the 50s, but ultimately doesn't get translated even in this kind of minorly tweaked version until the 80s and 90s. So I think we have to deal with the fact that we're in a field where the half-life is fairly long. This is another Gestalt diagram that Rowe and Slutsky use in their Transparencies article, and Eisenman's Riebstock Park plan from 1987. So essentially, the sort of the predicament, let's say, that architecture in America found itself in after the war was that it was beginning to be instituted in very banal terms. In other words, in terms of function and structure. And critics like Rowe and architects like Venturi wanted to some extent to revive a kind of rhetorical or representational aspect for architecture. So Rowe's opposition of Burnham and Root's Reliance building on the left against Mises' Glass Tower was an argument to say that at the turn of the century and in the early 20th century, that whereas American architecture understood the frame structure as a kind of economic efficiency, maximized floor space, that the grid or the frame structure in Europe was actually an ideological project. It wasn't to answer the problem of the office building specifically, but to answer the problem of architecture generally. In other words, there were no particular economic or political needs that Mises' Tower was addressing. It was addressing a kind of cultural problem, not an economic or engineering problem. And clearly when Rowe makes this distinction, it's because he wants to say, to some extent, we need to incorporate that ideological project into American architecture, and that American architecture's version of modernism had been limited to only two terms, much like Venturi's formula a little bit later suggests that, you know, for him, firmness and commodity, or let's say structure and function, you know, don't equal, you know, delight. That for Gropius, if you got A and B, you'd get C. For Venturi, he wanted to suggest that actually you still need to be intentional and self-conscious about the rhetorical aspect. So the first diagram, I guess, that I want to talk about is the 9 square as a diagram that would deliver an ideological project for American architecture, both in terms of design and in terms of pedagogy. So if you go to that previous slide of the two towers that Rowe used, these two diagrams, Corbusier's domino and this Van Doesburg axonometric, become the two diagrams that Rowe proposes as the curriculum at the University of Texas in Austin. In other words, for Rowe, modernism could be summed up by the frame structure and composition by intersecting planes. And that for him, unlike what was important about the Europeans, Rowe says, is that they could split those two things, whereas the Americans could only understand that you could, if you chose the frame structure, you had a typical spatial organization inside that mapped onto that grid. Whereas he says the Europeans never understood the frame structure and the composition of intersecting planes as having to be continuous, but actually they were separate investigations. So if you have sort of the frame structure and this kind of cubist transparency optical model of intersecting planes, then that combined with more or less contemporaneous late 40s work on that Rudolf Wittkover did on Palladio's villas, all of which, 11 of which in any case, get reduced to this plaid grid, essentially the 9 square. You get the kind of fundamental architectural problem probably of the last 40 years, at least for the first half of that period. One that from Texas then, you know, goes to Oregon, Cornell, Cooper Union, becomes the first architectural problem in the sense of being able to talk about frame structure, a composition of planes inside that structure, relations of center to periphery. It's essentially a dematerialized project and one that really has no program. It's a formal exercise, and it's a way of teaching modern architecture and understanding modern architecture as having a formal or rhetorical or representational aspect and not merely about construction and efficiency. In any case, that kind of invention of this problem then generates a series of Texas houses that Haydick himself undertakes. So he's doing it in the studio at the same time that he's doing it in his own practice. Again, this is actually, somewhat surprisingly, this is the first scheme for Venturi's mother's house on the left, which if you know the house, it ends up nothing like this. But in 1957, Venturi too was doing 9 squares. And this is a Texas house from early 60s by Haydick, Texas House 7. And then Eisenman's project on the left, House 2, and even 1989, Rem Koolhaas's sketch partie for the National Library of France. Although clearly what starts to happen is that the priorities of the 9-square problem begin to get repeated in a way that starts to swerve them and almost collapse their principles. At least that's the argument that I want to make ultimately about the bibliothèque on the right, that you get these, that essentially the 9 squares, kind of spatial organization, becomes condensed into these 9 elevator cores, so that the once open optical space becomes the kind of closed poché mechanical space as the kind of 9-square collapses on itself. But that, I'll sort of talk about that later. But I think it's interesting that the fact that it's a diagram that, of course, it's a Renaissance model. It's Renaissance geometry, or earlier, that gets appropriated. But it wasn't until the late 50s that there was the requisite combination of an interest in Gestalt psychology and Cubism, and I would say, although I won't talk about it today, kind of political liberalism, and a technological basis of the frame that enables this diagram to consolidate at this later period. And I guess that's the argument that I want to make later on, which is that, in other words, from Deleuze's argument about Foucault, he says that technology is social before it's technical. And I guess that's the kind of point that I want to make in the technology lecture. Because I want to understand the diagram as a kind of technology, and that it enables technology. It provides a problem that then technology can be solicited to deal with. A kind of second aspect of the diagram, I'll get back to that other one, is the issue of how it accommodates notions of repetition. Because my interest in the Neo Avant-Garde is not that they're about originality. The question is always how to repeat. The issue is how do you repeat with difference? And I think that the diagram, in a way, well, let's sort of go through the 2 models of repetition, or the 2 models of difference that, very briefly. Only that which is alike differs, which is one model, and then only differences are alike. Only that which is alike differs assumes an initial condition of identity out of which difference then flows. And I won't sort of go down the whole list for this talk, but the alternative model of only differences, but I'm sort of suggesting that it's like the way that you get difference like right and left because they both point back to a kind of previous identity, let's say the pair. Unlike a model of only differences are alike, which means that differences are primary and identity comes as a fallout of difference, as opposed to difference being a fallout of identity. Depends on which one you prioritize. So that model I see as a model that sets up taxonomies of proper species. It's a vertical model. This one is much more a kind of horizontal model where 2 different things conspire to produce a new kind of identity, which I think is a surrealist project, or the wasp and orchid, which is a kind of emblem that Deleuze and Guattari use in terms of a kind of cross-speciation that produces a new kind of identity or a new kind of whole. That kind of philosophical question, I guess, is, would be a kind of obscure, except for the fact that it does directly impact the way in which one understands architectural history and the possibilities for design. So all of Rowe's work on formalism comes out of this idea that you start, or let's say Rowe's version of formalism is that you start with approximate configurations and then you identify differences afterwards. So it's a kind of model that allows him to suggest as a kind of continuity between Palladio, let's say, and Corbusier. So that you basically identify identical configurations and then you start to identify differences after. It's sort of the same idea in his mentor's project, Rudolf Wittkover, where you end up with all these Palladio villas, 11 of them here, all of which get idealized in the 9-square plaid grid that I showed you earlier. In other words, these are all, let's say, fallen, they're not quite fallen or debased copies of, but this ideal model is underlying them all. And so that basically you can understand all of them as being their differences point back to the fact that they fall out of this common identity, meaning the nine square. So it's, again, it's a very vertical model of a taxonomy. It's typically what typology does. It groups things in those kind of categories of species. So let's move a little bit more toward practice. So if you look at, so a kind of understanding of modernism that falls out of that Rose model allows this kind of continuity so that the Villa Savoye, although it's a terribly dark and blurry slide, if you look down at this analysis of a Michelangelo facade, ultimately you get this kind of Michelangelo facade up on pilotis, kind of strip windows and this flat roof somehow. So there's this kind of transformation of Michelangelo into a kind of proto-Corb in the same way that the previous analysis of Palladio and Corbusier. Let's see if I'm going to do this right. No. I think that model of repetition, that first model, only all that which differs is alike, I think was the first one. See, I confuse myself sometimes. But the first the vertical model of repetition, I think, can characterize work like that of Richard Meyer. So I think that Meyer, like Rowe, a sort of progenitor, and Wittkover, is ultimately about supporting and repeating a modernist model in that way. I think there's a second generation that emerges in the late 60s that is interested in a different model of repetition. This is a photograph that this is an advertisement of Bernard Schumies, where at the same time that let's say, Meyer was designing that house, this is actually a condition of the Villa Savoye. So even though they're looking back to this model from the 20s, what's interesting for Bernard is the fact that this thing is in a state of ruin, and that's really what the architecture is about. It's not about the ideal geometries, but it's this kind of erotics of decay. And he's interested in both, in all the photographs, the ramp system, the circulation system, the plumbing areas, the dark, dank service rooms smeared with excrement and obscene graffiti. It's a very surrealist and Bataille version of Corbusier, as opposed to a very classical, ideal, pure white version of Corbu. So it's an attempt to recuperate Corbusier, repeat him in a different way. I think ultimately the same could be said for Koolhaas's work in terms of a kind of a very different repetition than Meyer's, one which, on the one hand, it solicits some of the same principles. I mean, it sort of looks at the 5 points, but it actually reads them in a very different way, so that the upright pilotis become this kind of wavy, grass-like support system. The free facade is interrupted by virtue of actually the swimming pool, which is the equivalent of the roof garden. That systematically the 5 points are both solicited and ultimately subverted. So it becomes, in a way, a kind of diagram of the work that starts to point to maybe the contradictions in the principles, but also that the combination of those principles could lead to a very different kind of project. So it's, in other words, I wouldn't say this kind of work is not about originality, but it is about repeating something in a different way than, let's say, Meyer's way. Ultimately, again, Rowe informed by a kind of cubist painting. This is called Three Faces on the left by Léger. I think there's a different attitude to the facade and frontality in the work of that second generation, and I would say that it's more along the lines of the face machines. In other words, understanding not the face as a kind of anthropomorphic condition of identity, but actually understanding the kind of proliferation of face factors that would actually produce a kind of proliferation of what ultimately he talks about as probe heads. Again, I think that move from cubism to surrealism is sort of one of the things that's at stake in the later Neo Avant-Garde. This is OMA's Zeebrugge project and at De Chirico. That the face is no longer the issue. It's not about establishing a face-to-face, optical, upright relationship, but the whole object, in a sense, becomes a head, which is sort of defacialized. I guess the reason I showed the face machines is because I think one of the issues of the diagram is also how to think since this is, again, technology, of the machine, but not the machine that we know, that actually, not the machine in the sense of Wes Jones, who I saw give a lecture last night on the boss, but the machinic. In other words, it's not about making picturesque a certain mechanical technology, but it's about how to think machinically, which is to say that there's much more of a continuity or cross-speciation between the biological and the artificial or the mechanical. In any case, I think that, for example, Corbusier's understanding of the bottle rack or the file cabinet as an inspiration for the unités, that kind of almost ready-made Duchampian machinic model of how to produce an architecture is actually, I think, already inscribed in Venturi, or later inscribed in the Football Hall of Fame competition. Because I think what's here's something. I mean, what's interesting is that there's a kind of football field over here. There's the grandstand, then there's the arc of the shed, and then there's this big billboard, and then ultimately a pool, a reflecting moat pool here. But what you sort of understand is, much like this is a machine, this too, it sort of understands the flat horizontal issues of the football field, flips them up like a drafting surface and makes them vertical, then reproduced the plays here, and then ultimately they're mirrored in this moat in the front. So it's a kind of mechanism in a way. The whole institution gets developed as a kind of big drafting table, or he calls it a high easel, in terms of how it operates. For me, what's interesting about this project is it starts to testify to what I think is the significant, what characterizes the Neo Avant-Garde and what moves it away from Colin Rowe, who is more or less a pure critic. What it establishes is a new role for the architect, which has been identified as the architect critic. In other words, the one who designs but also writes. No longer will those roles be separated into the kind of academic seminar setting and the studio designer setting, but actually they're hybridized in this generation. And so one can understand this project as a kind of testimony to moving the horizontal space of writing and flipping it up into the kind of vertical space of visual and architectural. So there's a way in which the project diagrams his own professional identity. And I think that what's interesting is that Venturi in that way is what I would call the first information architect, despite his recent embarrassment by that fact. He says, in his recent book, he says, we didn't produce a theory that was replacing architecture with art concepture and buildings with diagrams and words. But I guess, for me, I think that the lesson of the Neo Avant-Garde is precisely this diagrammatic lesson. And that, to a certain extent, it's the diagram in the contemporary has come to replace what the status the drawing had for architecture in the Renaissance as a historical argument for these people. Again, the same kind of organization in Haydick's sort of contemporaneous wall house. So that in terms of being the architect critics, or the thinking of architecture discursively or as a kind of information, I think the first generation Neo Avant-Garde is in a certain way interested in exhausting an analysis of architecture as a sign system. So whether that means in Venturi's case, architecture as an icon. In other words, they use Peirce's system of icon, index, and symbol, and each of the architects that I'm going to talk about, in a way, traces that path. So that we have Venturi's interest in the iconic sign, Eisenman here, House 2, and the kind of indexical sign, which is to say it's a trace of a process. And ultimately, the third figure that I'm sort of interested in that generation, Haydick's interest in the symbolic, both in the sense of language, establishing a series of operations or programs, and also this kind of mythic figural symbolic architecture. So that generation pretty much, slipping, even though I'm trying to hold it with my hand, it's sliding down. I guess part of the argument too is that they don't just invent, that what they do is they reread the modernist 20s avant-garde in new ways. And so, obviously Bonchamp, you can't see it here, but there's a Madonna there. I need a better slide of that. And then the Liebhaus with the Madonna in the front. For Venturi, what's important about Corbusier is the fact that he reframes everyday icons. So already he's directing a reading of history that's important for his contemporary problematic. Eisenman's particular rereading of Corbusier and his analysis of the domino suggests that the slab, this kind of technical structural system, in fact, is a diagram, a notational system, and that that you could have the columns in different places in relation to the slab or the clip-on stairs, and that would make a difference. In other words, it's not just happenstance, commercially efficient. He wants to reread Corbusier's domino through this series of analysis to say that it's a highly intended sign system. It's a kind of, that it's an index of how it was constructed. And again, I think you can see the same elements being developed, say in House 6, the same kind of rereading of Corb, misreading, enters his own work. And finally, Hayek also talking about the kind of figural, performative nature in his analysis of the Carpenter Center, and then his Bauhaus from 1973. Again, to suggest that repetition is not, it's not a, the Neo Avant-Garde is not about originality, but it's about repetition with a difference. To sort of jump to the second generation, my argument is that there's sort of two primary generations of the Neo Avant-Garde, one of which is that one I just showed, the Venturi, Eisenman, Hayek. The second generation being Libeskind, Schumi, and Koolhaas, at least the ones that I'm using as stand-ins. And it sort of takes us back to the machine idea also, in that, let's say, Libeskind's 3 lessons for architecture, the reading machine, the writing machine, and the memory machine, again, is trying to establish an alternative pedagogy there through lessons for architecture. But and he actually does a diagram of the 3 machines, and he associates the reading machine with the medieval, the memory machine with the Renaissance, and the writing machine with the modern. And he says that his project, the 3 machines, can really be summarized, he says, in that diagram, which is one of those Ken Frampton slides I don't have. But I think what's interesting about Libeskind is that it is, in fact, a rereading of his immediate predecessors, so that the reading machine, this medieval machine, is actually, and which carries books and is symbolic, is actually a rereading of Hayek. That the memory machine on the left, the Renaissance machine for him, is a kind of rereading of Venturi and the iconic. This is the Benjamin Franklin Memorial, again, a kind of memory machine, where people look into these optical devices. This is filled with these different optical and measuring devices on the left. And finally, the writing machine that he associates with the modern, let's say it's an indexical machine, it's a horizontal grid, I think relates to his commentary in a way on Eisenman. So that there's a way in which you can understand Libeskind's machines and their interrelationship as a kind of repositioning of his immediate predecessors. Sometimes these things get out of order. This is to sort of move into the segue from the first Neo Avant-Garde to the second one. These are 2 diagrams by Colin Rowe, one of which he calls plan without program or paradigm without program, and the other one program without plan. And he's more or less clearly indebted to the one on the left, the more typological one, that you start with a formal organization, then you pump program into it, as opposed to his problem with Brasilia, or a kind of technocratic architecture that starts with kind of forces and flows and then makes form out of that. So essentially, this is his diagram of Austin, Texas on the left, but of course it's a 9 square, what else could it be? He sort of opposes to this kind of tuning fork, which he's more questioning of. I think, though, it's that the tuning fork aspect of Dali's paranoid critical method is, in fact, animates that second generation. In other words, the first generation, Venturi, Hayek, Eisenman, moved through the 9 square problem, a very formal problem, because for them, function and structure are essentially bankrupt concepts. They're too close to the international style of modernism. But for the second generation, Neo Avant-Garde, they are much more open to the possibilities of function and structure and movement, and precisely that diagram that Rowe was dismissing. This is from Delirious New York on the left, which is Dali's paranoid critical method, which he says, limp, improvable conjectures supported or made critical by the crutches of Cartesian rationality. So essentially what this is it's a structure function machine. In other words, instead of form, it's all about program, this kind of blob of program, the bubble diagram, and the kind of support of structure. So in fact, Koolhaas, through Dali, is able to investigate function and structure as active elements rather than things that one needs to put aside in favor of the rhetorical or the formal. I think you can see that Dalian diagram translated. This is a model that of the diagram I showed earlier of the bibliothèque, so that these kind of the public spaces are actually these kind of floating blobs in the system that feed off of the Pochet system, so that in fact the public spaces are almost the secondary residual ones. Again, another diagram from Delirious New York, this cartoon theorem on the what he calls the cartoon theorem on the left. In other words, Rowe, in the late 50s, was embarrassed by the American experience in favor of the European one, and essentially wanted American architecture to become more European, more formal. Against modernism's blank elevation, he wanted to re-articulate it toward the idea of a facade. Koolhaas, in a way, comes back and says that this American kitsch actually has energies that we can now recuperate. So instead of the shallow space that Rowe is interested in, Koolhaas is much more interested in the fact of the deep plan. So that instead of saying that the elevation needs to be turned into a classical facade a la Rowe, Koolhaas and his office basically say that the elevation can even be reduced even further to a mere section. And so there's this kind of translation in the Karlsruhe project. I won't go through all of the, trying to essentially suggest this unconscious diagrammatic history of the recent 20th century. But I think part of it is that you begin to understand architecture as a series of documents more than you understand them as a series of monuments. This is appropriated by Deleuze and Guattari to describe the body without organs, and this is obviously OMA's Congrès Expo, which again is this kind of a non-hierarchical body, unlike the kind of model of different hierarchy that Rowe's model was in favor of. A slide that Koolhaas often uses to describe this kind of event without architecture, which in a certain way, the planes, trains, and automobiles model, which ultimately gets reconfigured as the center of Lille, this kind of void center which only reveals these kind of infrastructural circulation systems. This is PA's editorializing, not mine. And obviously for PA, the defenders of the real, these cartoonish views could only be seen as silly and dismissed. But of course they folded, so. So I guess what I want to suggest is that away from the first generation's unfolding of this 9-square formal problem, that was a certain technology for architecture, that after 68 and by 72, that architects become much more motivated by a kind of a different diagram. In some cases, you could say the panoptic one, which is how do you organize and control populations and multiplicities. In other words, it becomes no longer a semiotic formal critique the way it was out of the 9-square, but it becomes much more an institutional problem, engaging issues of program and material. And so this is OMA's rendition of a kind of renovation of a panoptic prison in the Netherlands, where they suggest just piling on different disciplinary diagrams on top of one another, never eradicating them, but suggesting that that society always chooses a certain kind of disciplinary diagram or regime and exposing that quality. Again, as a kind of alternative repetition from Corbusiers' gesture of throwing down the kind of cruciform towers in Paris, to OMA's La Défense scheme, which is the hand peeling up the surface to reveal this kind of grid underneath. Again, it's a model of architecture that's much more interested in, let's say a model of ecology that's more interested in decay and entropy. So this is the kind of analysis where the site opens up. I'm just going to go through these quickly. And this other diagram on the left, which is the diagram for Lille that began the Lille program, which is to say that there's going to be this new infrastructure that would obviously you'd be able to go from Paris to Lille in 50 minutes rather than an hour, 2.5 hours. You'd be able to get to London in an hour instead of 7 hours. So that essentially this infrastructure is going to collapse Europe onto Lille, this very improbable city. And it's from that they understand that there's a new kind of post-national collectives out of this diagram. In other words, what the diagram diagrams is virtual relationships between ecologies and collectives. And I guess this susceptible model of decay and entropy on the right, and this other model of a kind of densification or the production of post-national collectives, I would say are alternative ways of thinking about the real. In other words, not the new urbanist model of community and sustainability, but actually about these kind of collectives and kind of susceptibility. So that the diagram isn't opposed to the real or its technocrats, but actually it proposes alternative models of reality. Or what John Reichman says, the virtual is a real of which we don't yet possess the concept. Again, this kind of interest in entropy you can also see in Shumi's La Valette project, where the project kind of drifts across the plane. I guess one of the more interesting formulas in terms of this virtual diagram is this formula by Koolhaas for the Congrès Expo Center, which is, you can't read it, 7 Van Goghs, 18 de Koonings, or 6 Jackson Pollocks, which is a lot of art, would buy Congrès Expo. But for the price of its 1,200 parking spaces in downtown Tokyo, 40 more Congrès Expos could be built in Lille. So there's this kind of weird, in other words, beginning to understand the building as a highly contingent on economic and political forces. In other words, the building isn't this monument, but it happens to be a temporary consolidation of flows, so that you have to start to register in the architecture the fact that it could, in fact, be something else. And that's sort of the virtual possibility, that this real is one possibility among other contingencies. I think you can actually see it inscribed materially in certain projects, even in a kind of minimal detail, like the surrealist tree trunk on the Kunsthal. When you start to read it against the kind of more refined wood handrails and the rest of the project, that there's this kind of state of material transformation that he's registering, a kind of phase shift, that exerting different forces on the same material will reveal different traits. Again, virtual possibilities of the same material. So this is sort of where I want to pretty much conclude or begin to sum up. So there's some time either for eating or questions, depending on what you prefer. This is how we started to think about this quest in the post-war period for difference, and actually how you would materialize or represent difference or achieve difference, which seems to be the postmodern problem, the post-war problem. And so, sort of simply, without going into this is done for another project, but from the model of hierarchy of Beaux-Arts or homogeneity of modernism, both of which are what I would say either-or strategies, postmodernism, in a typical historicist way, you could understand as the both-and model, which is to say heterogeneity as collage, both-and. In other words, postmodernism's problem with modernism was that modernism was exclusive. As opposed to that, the neither-nor model, I would say, is deconstructivism, a different model of heterogeneity. Instead of heterogeneity is collapsing or collaging different systems, it's a model which suggested it's standing out from a context. So its problem with modernism was modernism's implicit humanism, not its exclusivism. In any case, to sort of suggest this move from the either-or of the Beaux-Arts to the either-or of modernism, a move from centrality, axiality, symmetry to repetition, seriality, the facade more important than the organization, as opposed to regularity over formal symmetry, ornament over structure rather than structure over the sign. Also different urban models, the city as a body, Burnham, city as a machine, Hilbersheimer, conservation, production, the radial, and the grid. The way in which 1 and 2 then conspire to produce postmodernism, so that Venturi's decorated shed, you take one from column A, one from column B, or DPZ's radial and grid of Seaside, take one, their version of the best of both worlds, the city as a museum or as consumption, and ultimately the move from 3 to 4, from that version of heterogeneity pluralism, eclecticism, to this other model of heterogeneity, from seaside to the negation of the grid and the axes in something like Lubiskin's Potsdamer plots. In any case, it occurred to us that it's a kind of destitute diagram, that both attempts to engage difference were not particularly interesting or productive, and so we proposed this, what we were calling a non-binary logic of the both and neither, or a false positivism, that would both maintain and subvert, producing objects that no matter how you addressed them, they would provisionally answer yes, meaning that they would ultimately undermine the kind of typological or taxonometric codes to understand form. So that our examples became, a simulacrum in philosophy, which in a certain way subverts the hierarchy of a model and a copy, a la Wittkover, or kind of physics model for us, which was to say that certain phenomena in physics, if you test them one way, they say they're a wave, and if you test them another way, they're a particle. But since classical physics, at least as I understand it, was based on that opposition, it's a kind of a phenomenon that, in its answering yes to both testing regimes, ultimately suggests that the testing regimes aren't viable. And so I guess I also want to close, since I've been trying to suggest the virtual possibilities of the diagram as an alternative to tectonics a la Frampton, or the social project a la the New Urbanists or certain sociologists. I also want to suggest that this both and neither possibility is really, well, let's put it another way. There's also an aesthetic sensibility today that seems to be arguing against the overwrought forms of postmodernism and decon, and it's sort of typically minimalism. But I think it's ultimately a reduced version of minimalism and not really what minimalism was about. In other words, minimalism is not about ideal Platonic form, simplicity, and honesty and essential quality of materials. It's actually, what's interesting about minimalism is precisely that it's a both and neither condition. And this is actually something even its contemporary critics like Michael Fried understood. In other words, even though Fried was critical of minimalism, he understood that what it was really, and he almost says this, is that it's both and neither painting and sculpture. In other words, modernism had been defined by, species identification. In other words, medium specificity. There was such a thing as painting, and there was such a thing as sculpture. And that modernism was founded on that kind of principle of medium specificity, again, very speciated, typologically, taxonometric. What minimalism does is it sort of answers that it's, in some regards, it's painting, and in another regard, in other words, it comes out of a problem of painting, and the other way, it comes out of a problem of sculpture. So that if you frame minimalism from the modernist categories, it provisionally answers yes to being painting and provisionally answers yes to being sculpture. And in that way, it undermines a kind of modernist taxonomy. So what's interesting about minimalism is not about ideal simple form, and it's not about truth to materials, which I think are the debased lessons of minimalism that we've been rehearsing today in the most recent period, but that in fact it's about establishing a both and neither system, and that in fact it's about constructing clearly with voids, that in fact the version of minimalism can also be understood diagrammatically, I guess, as opposed to iconically. This is Hans Hacke's isolation cube, and this is both the Sierpinski carpet and the Menger sponge. What's obviously interesting for me is that there are 9 squares, but it's a kind of 9 square that undoes. It's the 9 square to kill all 9 squares. That instead of the use of the 9 square to support architecture as being based on structure and space, that this is a model that essentially suggests that it might be about event and surface, because what's important in the model is the way in which it's a kind of iterative process of voiding the center ninths of this 9 squares, let's say. So it's event and process, and ultimately producing a kind of three-dimensional object which is no longer about containing spaces, but that it's ultimately almost entirely a surface. equally, I think there's models of minimalism that we haven't looked at because they don't obtain to this kind of Platonic model. And so I think that that begins to suggest a kind of repressive way, and here I'm talking about Herzog and de Meuron, in which minimalism has been incorporated into architecture as a critique of decon or postmodernism. And again, I think that really what's at stake in a minimalist aesthetic would be this diagrammatic capacity to identify contradictions and then undermine them by a kind of excessive condition. And ultimately that architecture, instead of moving from the formal 9-square to the institutional model, the panopticon or power relations, that actually could be about producing new kinds of diagrams, which is essentially producing new models of reality. I guess that's about all I want to say, so that there's a little time left. Thanks.
Why don't we take some time for questions, and then I'm going to feed Bob, such as we can now here. And then, if you like, he'll have a bit of time. He'll come around to the studio. So if you like, you're coming to your studio, let me know your name or studio. What studio you're in. So, what were the questions? Comments?
Yeah, you mentioned that the text range might have some relationship to sort of pluralism and time. In the context of the one-dimensional man, do you think that the sort of diagram is necessarily not there for a certain diagram? The reductionation diagram sort of negates the possibility of
I think what, Rowe's response, which is the classical liberal response, it's a critique of what he considers authoritarianism, which for him was a certain debased version of modernism, of either futurism and technophilia or a kind of, a kind of vernacular, regressive model also. I think that for him, and he actually uses collage as more of his model, and he sort of talks about collage and relates it to the idea of the law, and that there's always an issue of structure, and for him it's almost structuralist to some extent, which is to say that there's always a kind of a grid and a structure within which you can have events, or, that's his model of collage, that there's no such thing as either, that he wants to avoid either complete anarchy, which he would see as impossible, or this kind of complete structuration, so that this kind of both-end combination of the grid and collage, or models of collage. In other words, you can't have freedom unless there's certain constraints. So it's a very classical liberal model that I think that Rowe and then the problems that they develop are about addressing. Perhaps for a Marxist, that would be it would be the authoritarianism of liberalism, but it's a liberal model. I would say, as opposed, it is about producing a kind of heterogeneity. It just happens to be a very contained model of heterogeneity.
Do you think diagrams carry an ethical disposition? And if the answer to that is yes, then how, in terms of documenting, to characterize the use of the diagram, can diagrams, is it simple enough? To account for societal or cultural contingencies, let's say, within an ethical economy?
I think that there were models. I guess I want to distinguish the use of the diagram that I'm talking about from two powerful predecessor models. In other words, I think Rowe certainly was interested in the diagram, although the diagram for him became reduced to a partie in a kind of formal diagram. On the same time, I would want to distinguish it from the kind of functionalist or the cybernetic kind of Chris Alexander model of diagramming, which would be somehow about finding the proper balance between a series of forces and then kind of, I guess what Herder criticized as the GFD education of building the diagram or whatever. So against the kind of formalist or functionalist alternatives of the diagram, I think in part, what the diagram does is, one thing it does, and this is not enough, I would say, is it exposes that society and cultural relations are always, and technological relations are always chosen by a particular society, a particular diagram of society, and then if we can both recognize that and possibly perceive or produce alternative diagrams, what it suggests is that the world is more open to plasticity, more open to change, either in social or technical change. But I guess I would say it wouldn't, at least the understanding that I'm trying to promote, it wouldn't say that this is a kind of a better or the most adequate display of resources, just that those questions are always up for grabs, and that it's important to be able to conceive of alternative models of answering those things.
Another question, if I could. It's an interesting set of relationships we find, I think, within minimalism. And I'm wondering, with respect to both, that either you categorize minimalism as somewhere between, or oscillating between painting and sculpture, which are certainly taxonomic.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could speak of that movement that both is neither with respect to, say, structure rather than taxonomies or categories or classifications, which is slightly easy.
Right. Straw man.
Okay.
All right. I mean, I think that yeah, because even in Rowe it's a little complicated, because on the one hand there seemed to be, and maybe it's more true in his mentor Vitkover, this kind of formal, almost Platonic kind of understanding of taxonomy, and Rowe already becomes a little bit more interested in the idea of a kind of structuralism in terms of in other words, it's not like choosing one or the other, but there's a kind of balance where you're flipping between the two. So even there, it's not a kind of hard and fast choice. I guess there's something about the fact that you're always, in Rowe's ideal model of balancing structure and event, or the structuralist model of difference, which is relational, obviously, and not typological or taxonometric. I think there's a way in which I think even the structuralist model goes back to that first model of repetition and difference. In other words, that red and green are different only in relationship to some larger structure, so that even structuralism somewhat attains to that diagram of difference. Whereas, again, sort of maybe throw in the kind of interesting contemporary, which is probably Michael's interest or other people's around here's interest too, in terms of contemporary scientific models that would suggest the idea of emergence, where different things come together to produce this event or this collapse in a way which is no longer identifiable as, well, that's the structuring moment and that's the event moment, and that we can balance between, the functional shed and the rhetorical facade, that those moments are not, appropriately balanced to one world versus another world, and we can sort of have it both ways, and that they play off one another, but that actually that model of a world, of a kind of noli, ultimately a noli world, it is one possibility, and I guess a kind of the possibility of a phase space as opposed to a collage space would be an alternative model, let's say, of difference. And so I think that the structuralist model in a certain way falls by the same wayside as the formalist Platonic model in that. Despite its interest in relationality, it still has a kind of model of a transcendental signified, or something that undergirds and therefore is prior in a way to those differences.
I'd like to, kind of in the spirit of these backward loops, which I guess is more of a model than a diagram, I'd like to sort of open the one that you showed last, kind of can of words in a way, which is the two things that you brought up. One is the candy diagram, and the second is this idea of the wheel. Because now with complexity theory and neural models, all those things are going to feed into very, very interesting combinations, which takes us back to your commenting about the Copenhagen interpretation of mechanics, and I think there's several things and it's not too bad. you argue in one of two ways. You try to find some kind of synthesis that maintains the difference. Or to realize the question is the art, and in fact, you're back to this problem of the deal. But I want to ask you a little something, or I'll make a comment, and I'm sure you would have something to say about it, is the thing that I've always found interesting and frustrating when I read all this about Canadian schemas are that they are attempts to diagram violence, and that all of them really are about change, not stability. It's a funny sort of thing, like the 9-square problem fixates a certain plenitude, which is all possible ways to organize space in terms of edge and center. And you do more and you don't really do things, you do less and you lose the center. So it's an interesting kind of dynamism, but it doesn't read that way at all. I look at it. With the Canadian scheme and all the complications that you get around them, we're really attempting to show displacements in a way, on other languages, body and all that kind of stuff. But it's very rich. It drove him to kind of combinatory system like Finkus tried to explicate. It did a very good job of explicating, where you have patterns and then you keep feeding the patterns back into themselves, and then you find all kinds of very interesting contradictions and disparities, and you get into a whole linguistic structuralism, trying to explore and explode. And it seems to me that then takes you to the edge. That takes you to the edge of Lacan's sort of usurpation of Heidegger in a funny, unacknowledged way as the real. And for Heidegger, obviously, the real was unexposed. And have a lot of metaphors for that, clear and all that sort of thing. Whereas Lacan was very specific. It was the unsymbolized, and it had a very, very obvious function. But it was something about which you couldn't speak in a funny sort of way. And now coming to the way complexity theory is really emphasizing repetitions and making repetitions an absolute part of everything. That if you look at the possible ways repetitions can occur, you get the edge of chaos. And I think in all the contemporary ideas, that's in some ways the richest. Because going back to the way particle, it says the way you form a reality, the way you finally get to the point where it can be symbolized in some way, is this relationship between what crudely is freedom and structure. And too much freedom and nothing will occur. Really, you have a lack of anything that can repeat itself into some form, and on the other hand, of course, it's frozen form. So I wonder if I'm just pushing it, because you put up the diagrams of genetic landscapes and stuff like that, and specifically shooting those who are really aware of that. How do you situate the diagram in the fact that dynamism is now the thing that's being modeled? And certainly, you find all the time the students are trying to do kinetic architecture. I mean, it's compilation in terms in some ways, and in other ways, it's really an interesting challenge.
Right. I mean, the admission of the defeat of that actually is sort of the Gordon-Matic-Clark response, because all you can do is cut it apart and perform it and move on. I think that people like Schumi and even older people like Hayek were exposed to the possibility that somehow we need to take these lessons into architecture, even as inadequate a medium as that is. Or maybe it's only possible in those kind of inadequate mediums where you have to struggle to try to get those little minor effects of animation and dynamism in the most static of media, because anywhere else it's a kind of literal so what condition. I mean, if you were to sort of say that about information technologies or whatever, in a certain way, it's inherent, I wouldn't want to say inherently, but its capacities are more dynamic and have this kind of feedback loops in them, so that the only, it wouldn't be much of a challenge to articulate dynamism in those systems. Actually, the challenge seems to be much more, how do you do it? I mean, the problem is also the promise that architecture has, unlike the other ones. And so,
It doesn't have a promise there. I mean, for example, if you just look at it from the simplest, most idiotic point of view, that you're going to have perpendicular structures as long as you have gravitational fields, because that is really the simplest and the most efficient way to deal with it. Whereas when you don't, you start to get these curvilinear forms, and actually, we haven't put any space stations up with their cubes. As a matter of fact, it would be a very, very odd thing to see a cube.
The Borg notwithstanding.
What?
The Borg notwithstanding. The Borg. If anybody's Star Trek fans, they
sorry.
We're going to the fire universe of big 9 squares.
Well, also, back in 2009, see now, I mean, we're trying to discover with new materials, and they allow us to have what you might call aerodynamically, it's not really aerodynamic, but aerodynamically implied shapes in architecture. It begins to say that they're lighter than earthly structures, in a sense. Whereas the earthiness of architecture is really one of the things that help define it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're both, you know, a certain level of practical, again, I'm not sure I would consider them essential issues, and then also institutional issues. And so I think that a lot of what seems, the stability that architecture promotes, in fact, is as in part an institutional or cultural construct as much as it is a necessary one. So the issue is, where is there the room to play and to upset that cultural model of stability that architecture is supposed to provide? I mean, because certainly, if you want to take the art example, you know, at a certain point someone would say, well, it's supposed to be a painting that's on a wall, it's not supposed to droop down, it's not supposed to be on the floor, it's not supposed to be out in the middle of the desert somewhere. I mean, there was a way in which the terms of painting and art, or art as identified with painting primarily, could get dismantled and displaced, but that was a kind of institutional critique. And I think that some of those institutional issues, which are not native or inherent to the medium of architecture, are things that one can operate on. You know, and I think that there are different kinds of structuring systems that one can think about, actually, and you know, part of it too is that I mean, to some extent, what you were saying earlier suggests that, I mean, you know, even Krauss, when she uses the Lacanian diagram, I mean, she's still a formalist, even when she's talking about the inform or the unformal. It's always against the kind of formal modernist model, and it's a, you know, in other words, it's not an abandonment of modernism, really. It's this kind of, this other acceleration, as you say, inside of it. You know, in some sense, I think that that's where architecture is trapped too, although, you know, that, which is why the 9 square has such a long, durable lifespan, even when it seems to involute or undermine or subvert the principles that it was based on, so that when you get to OMA's bibliothèque and it seems to invert all the hierarchies or all the values of the 9 square, it's working within that paradigm in order to make those things operable, to upset those hierarchies of center and periphery or service and served, or, you know, vertical and horizontal, or, you know, upright vertical versus more continuous surfaces that aren't on the 90-degree relationships, which are perfectly buildable and functional, but clearly have another kind of cultural charge or diagram to them. You know,
I've always found that I actually go to copy that just enthusiasm and make this country in the summer just to the students go around school to see what would happen. You know, what happened. But what's subversive about it is it's not only 2 nor 3 dimensional,
right.
So it's 5 dimensional. And that's really, if you really try to place yourself inside that space and play with it, you really have to think about volume, surface, and totally different way. But I was just one final question. I wonder, your first comments were rather challenging in the sense that, you know, I wonder how you would, what curricular implications there are to your original statements about technology and science. Because we're in a revolution as far as technology is concerned, I think, in architectural world. And it doesn't seem to have any direction, it just seems to be changing very quickly. What are the implications?
Well, I guess if I was sort of identifying this pendulum swing where the 9 square became a problem, and then it was not a problem in a bad sense, but the problem, and that seemed to become irresponsible by its formalism, its lack of materiality, its lack of program, that next generation logically began to look to material and program as generators, ultimately to the most recent swing, which is a swing to the real, which is almost, among certain corners anyway, design can't be taught, or design is not really an issue. What's an issue is these, you know, we want you to be either, some people would say, engineers and technologists, others would say, you know, social scientists and behaviorists. I think that the abandonment to those disciplines is the problem. And what's interesting about architecture, in terms of the role of the architect, which is the issue of pedagogy in ways, is that I mean, I see the architect not as an engineer, not just dealing with static forces, but dealing with much more horizontal cultural forces. So for me, the definition of the architect is that he or she is an organizer of information, and that's really the role, and that's why the diagram becomes a tool, as opposed to the architect as a draftsman. Therefore, the drawing becomes a tool at a certain model from the Renaissance as identifying the role. So the question would be, yeah, how do you deal with lawyers and code writers and bureaucrats in banks and all those other, how do you balance and adjust and channel all those other kinds of information and statistics? Because I don't believe that their world is more real than our world. I mean, their world, why is their abstraction our reality?
It's the issue of real.
So, I mean, I think that the issue would be, how do you put central in a design studio and in education this possibility of understanding more plastic relations and again, to avoid the structuralist dichotomy of kind of anarchy and, do what you want, finger paint, that's okay, or, this is the right way to design. It's been done for 2,000 years and it, still seems to work. But somewhere between those two, there's another way of working which has a kind of rigor to it that at the same time opens alternative possibilities. So it's not about a kind of self-expressionism, which I think a lot of studios, they kind of fall into pluralism, which I think actually happens, and certainly where I am teaching now, UCLA seems to be a kind of, den of you do your thing, I'll do mine, and maybe it'll add up to something. But I think we have to be much more programmatic about that. In other words, I think the new urbanists, what they're successful at is precisely to say, here's a program, and that's why they're out there, getting the jobs. And I think that we need to have a counter program. I think it's not, we need to create a positive program out of the kind of theoretical sophistication and speculation that we've had. Part of that is a kind of political, social program. Part of it is a pedagogical program to develop new techniques and new institutions that will promote the ideas that in fact we find more important, rather than kind of anything goes pluralism as a lesson of decon, which I don't think that's the lesson.
Would you go so far to say that the architects and effect systems designers and the materiality is one aspect of the more complex design?
Yeah, if that's another way to say that there are organizers of information in the sense of ecological ones and more immaterial ones and collective ones and economic forces, yeah.
I hear you.
Can a sensibility towards a repetition difference sustain a representational model, or are they just mutually exclusive virtually all the times?
Yeah, I mean, I have sort of two minds on that. On the one hand, clearly, I think the diagrammatic model is more operational and performative than it is representational, in the sense of postmodernism being representational or decon being representational. On the other hand, I ultimately believe that one of architecture's tools is this aspect of the rhetorical or the ideological, or that gap between reality and actually being able to signify something other than that. And so that we operate within that gap, otherwise we're builders. And I see us as different than that. So, again, whether we can come up with another word, I mean, again, I would sort of want to use the word diagrammatic as an alternative to representation or the real in terms of what that architecture is about. But clearly, ultimately, to the extent that architecture is a discipline, I do think that it has that form. I mean, I'm not trying to overthrow the formal model at all, but sort of recharge it with something else. So my answer is I hope so, because I think that's what we teach people and what we want to do.